This week you'll be reading in chapter 6 and 7 about ballistic and manipulative skills, the development of those skills. And I'll have to apologize because I realized that some of the questions in Lab 1 needed you to have some of this information, so I don't know why it was done in the order it was done for that lab, but just so you know, I'm sorry if you didn't quite get some of those concepts because you hadn't read them yet to be able to do that in your Lab 1 questions. Chapter 6 talks about the ballistic movements, so like throwing and kicking and striking and punting. So those are basic movements, motor movements that we're learning as we're growing up. Now, not all kids learn how to properly throw a ball or how to properly kick a ball or how to properly use a racket to strike like a tennis ball or something like that. So if you're having a client, let's say you're a physical therapist and you're having a client having trouble with their shoulder and you're having them throwing, they may not have learned how to throw properly, so that might not be a good judgment of whether their shoulder's in getting better or not. Looking also like you're going to be a PE teacher. A lot of times, like for instance, when you're teaching students how to throw, they have to be developmentally ready to have all the skills of the throwing. And I've had students in high school that still didn't know how to throw properly. So if they don't get taught these skills, they're not going to know them and be able to perform them. Also, as you're teaching these skills, what I find is like if you put a competition into it. So let's say you're teaching them how to kick a soccer ball. If you put competition into it and they haven't learned the skill well enough, their form is going to suffer because they're trying to do it in a game situation or they're trying to do it faster than they should be able to or should be doing it because they haven't really learned the skill properly. So take that into consideration if you're a PE teacher. Also, if you're asking them, for example, to throw for accuracy, their skill might not be as good anymore because you're putting something on them to try to achieve a goal of some kind instead of just worried about the skill of throwing something. Hopefully you've gone through the PowerPoint and you've clicked on the videos and seen all the different levels, the early kicker, the early striker, the early thrower, all those things to see what it looks like when you're first beginning or learning the skills, and then as you go into the more developed slides to see what a proficient kicker or a proficient thrower or a proficient striker would look like. Well, let's look at catching real quick. It's one of those skills that you can tell right away if the student or the client is a beginning catcher or a more advanced catcher. So think about some constraints when the task is catching. For example, there could be various objects that might be harder or easier to catch or even throw. For example, a football. A football is shaped differently than a regular ball is, or it's bigger in the hand than like a softball or a baseball. It's different shape and so forth. So, and also catching that object would be different also. So think of the the task that needs to be done in the catching or the throwing or the kicking or the striking, and think about what environmental or other constraints would come into play when they're trying to do that activity. There are things that can be done to help the client or the student to be able to be better at those movement exercises. Being able to, like for example, bigger surface area of a tennis racket if we're talking about striking a tennis ball. Some environmental constraints that might come into play, like for example, if you're playing volleyball outside versus playing volleyball inside, if you're teaching a PE class. Some environmental constraints might occur, like for example the weather, the wind, the sun in the eyes, those things like that would make it more difficult to do some of those tasks, like striking the volleyball or catching a softball or catching a football or striking a tennis ball or kicking a soccer ball. All of those have some kind of environmental constraint. If you're playing them inside or outside, there'll be some differences in that. Hopefully you went through the PowerPoint slides and you looked at some of those videos with the different levels of the ballistic skills and the manipulative skills development. Just think about like when you were a kid and what you couldn't do, and now that you're older, the things you can do and how you've progressed. Or go out and watch some kids playing games and see how their skill is. Now, age doesn't always have is not always an indicator of how good or proficient the person's going to be in the skill. Like I talked about before, you have some constraints. So, for example, somebody that does not practice throwing a ball is not going to be as good as somebody that is playing baseball or softball all the time and are throwing that ball all the time and so forth. So there are, like I said, age or maturity doesn't have an impact as much as them being able to practice the skill.